excuses immoral actions. You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? But I can at least acknowledge that I can see people trying to do good according to what they think is good. And that's something. It's not everything, it doesn't redeem anything, but I can appreciate that these are people who are trying to do good in their own understanding. And if we can come to a better understanding of what is good, then our actions would come to alignment. But even then, right, even if we can't come to agreement in those areas, and there's areas that I find abhorrent in terms of their opinions and beliefs, I can still see other aspects of them that are really virtuous and good. And so I can acknowledge that these are good people for the most part, and I'm not saying it broadly across everything, but as on an individual basis, I'll try and judge this. And I find ground for me to be able to get along well with them. The standard at the world at the moment is if they believe in something evil, or they think they believe in something evil, they must be a wholly evil person, and they will not only not associate with them, they will encourage people to not support them in their work, their career, everything. It is like a shockingly aggressive stance that pushes to the destruction of people's lives. And that's why I think it's really important, even though Lindsay Ellis holds many opinions I disagree with, and she's even supported cancellation, like this type of cancellation before. Like, look at her view, Lindsay, you've made public statements about your views on J.K. Rowling. You've encouraged people to delete videos they've made with people that have made statements that are deleted. Like, wow. The more recent one is with Tom Scott, and he made a collaboration with an associate of mine, actually, Jill Bearup. I've done a collaboration with her, and encouraged Tom to delete the video that he did with Jill, because in the past she made what people are interpreting as problematic statements. And that's, again, supporting a type of cancellation. And by the way, just on my note, like, association with Jill, we disagreed our reviews of the Last Jedi throne room fight scene, okay? We almost have diametrically opposed opinions of that fight scene, right? Doesn't mean that I can't get along well with her. I've done a collaboration with her on a small little YouTube short that she's done. And again, because I think it's a virtue to be able to get along with people that you disagree with. And it doesn't mean that they're bad people. That's people's views about that. That getting along with people who you disagree with is not only it's not a bad thing, but it's a good thing. Because can we encourage anyone to really consider what the end result is about rampant cancellation? If I was to hold that same standard and cancel anyone who has opinions that I find abhorrent and immoral, right? And I would say that they're terrible people. I would encourage people to unsubscribe, not support, and everything like that. And if everyone did that, that's the kind of standard that's being pushed. Where will that lead?
Well, what we're getting now.
Even worse. I think there's like... Because there are people who are trying to push back against this whole cancellation thing, and this is why I think Lindsay shouldn't be cancelled, and she shouldn't self-cancel her, even though she makes content I disagree with. The fact is, the tweet this is all, sprouting from, I kind of, her take was perfectly valid. Like, Rey of the Last Dragon absolutely had a lot of visual similarity to Avatar: The Last Airbender. But then we go back to, again, that question about why people vilify others so much for having the wrong opinion, where will it lead to? I was letting that hang to try and encourage people to see the obvious conclusion. The obvious conclusion is a type of massive division in society like we've never seen before. When I say like we've never seen, we actually have seen divisions in society to this level, and they have always resulted into armed conflict. That's the end result. Yeah. When you look at the ideological differences that were happening in World War II, the differences that people were having, like these aggressive differences in ideology, were pitting family members against each other, brother against brother, and stuff like that. And it did escalate into armed, large-scale conflict. And if you think it can't go that way, we've already seen violence, legitimate, real-world physical violence break out in these ideological differences. And it comes down to people not tolerating the other.
In a different way to how they'd say it,
Yeah, there is not enough tolerance in society.
Again, I don't see it coming from I only see it coming from one side.
I see it enacted vastly more on one side. I do see elements of intolerance on the right, of course.
Well, who's inviting who onto whose channel, you know?
Well, I think there's more open discussion, absolutely, on the right. But there, like, for instance, the reaction to this Lindsay Ellis thing. I have been tempted and have felt my gut instinct reaction to this is to condemn Lindsay and say you get what you deserve. But I think that's too intolerant. If we want to reflect the type of tolerance that should be in society, I think we need to be better. And that's why we're making this video, to kind of discuss it in a more open and mature way, and also to try and support where we can support, not making any concession on our standards. For instance, Lindsay does not deserve to be attacked for the way she has been for her tweet. Like,
What was her tweet?
again, she basically said something like, we should make a new subgenre for medias or movies or whatever that look like Last Airbender or something like that, in reference to Raya the Last Dragon.
It's like a Western anime.
Yeah, I you know, Asian-inspired kind of fantasy, which is usually a mesh of different Asian cultures and stuff like that. There's nothing wrong with that too. Now, people would get offended so vastly about that. Speaks to some huge problems. There's been a larger kind of development after this tweet that Lindsay gave, which is the stress and other mental health issues that have been resulting of this vicious type of criticism and the types of online attacks that's been lobbed against her is causing her to now basically just leave social media entirely. She's leaving YouTube, and she has made a statement on it that's been shared online, and we have it here, that I'd like to go through and discuss, because there is a lot to discuss and break down. And I actually feel it's inappropriate for anyone who disagrees with Lindsay to crow about it, say good riddance, you know, thank goodness you're gone, or you get what you deserve, or anything like that, because one, if we want to push back against this uncharitable, unforgiving culture, we need to be more forgiving and charitable. It's as simple as that. And so, also, we shouldn't cheer that someone's is purposely taking away their voice to share their opinion.
No one is, though. She's taking away her own voice.
She is, but I think people will be celebrating that she's decided to stop. And look, I disagree with a lot of what she says, but I don't want her to stop saying it. I would rather have a discussion about it, and perhaps potentially find where we see eye to eye. If there's differences that we can't, you know, ever agree upon, that's fine. But I think there are areas in which, who knows, maybe her opinion could be swayed, or maybe mine could be swayed, as we come to a better understanding. But that's now lost and gone if she's completely cut herself off.
It's been lost for a while.
Well, one of the things that I hope would encourage potential discussion like this is if we can show that we're willing to be forgiving.
Oh, we more than absolutely are.
Yeah, but also show charity and also sympathy and compassion when someone's going through a really difficult time. I do admit there's some conflict I have, because I do feel Lindsay has encouraged a certain type of cancel culture.
In what way?
Well, she made a video on J.K. Rowling being very condemning about her views on transgenderism, J.K. Rowling's views on transgenderism, and almost encouraging people to not read Harry Potter or not support her or not give her any more money and things like that. I see that, and I can't help and see a parallel between the type of care, because I hope Lindsay would be able to acknowledge that that had the potential to create a hate mob of the same level, if not greater, than the hate mob she is perceiving coming after her. What I find it shocking that even if you disagreed with J.K. Rowling's stance on things, does that ruin the work of Harry Potter or any message you see behind Harry Potter or the value that it brought in your life?
No, I don't think so. Welcome. Sorry, I'm just reflecting on something I've had on my head for quite some time. It's cancel culture and all that. It's not really relevant to the stream. I'm just, you know, watching stuff.
I don't know.
I think there's an even deeper. Got to roll back a bit too.
Mm-hmm.
She put out a post saying, a video saying, "Here's how I feel about what J.K. Rowling said."
Mm-hmm.
I look. I completely disagree with everything she believes based on what you told me.
Hmm.
But I don't think she's responsible for any hate that gets directed their way just because you put out a video saying, "I don't like you."
Here's an interesting point.
Even though I disagree with that
I'm not
completely.
sure I agree on it, because there's going to be a lot of people who watch that you'll end up naturally convincing by the logic that you're presenting, by the standards that you are saying these are my standards and stuff. And the natural, unavoidable result is that if some people start agreeing with you, then they will naturally adopt the same kind of stance you have in not supporting the person.
Yeah, sure, but you're not at fault if that person says of a death threat. I don't think you are.
Well, there's a difference between, because I don't think Lindsay was in any way saying...
Oh,
sending
absolutely
it,
not. That's my point.
But I think she was saying... I'm going off memory, it was a long time since I watched the video, but she was voicing concerns about supporting J.K. Rowling through liking Harry Potter because of her stances.
Well, let's try to be as nuanced as possible. If I make a video saying, I hate communism, and this is a video I probably would make, I hate communism, here is why it is bad, here's all the history of communism that I can possibly put together, and why you should hate it. Am I responsible if someone's like, yeah, you know what, I hate communism too, and they start attacking communists on Twitter?
No. The reason is, in that video, you didn't say communists should be shot.
Did this lady say that?
No, she didn't say J.K. Rowling.
Well, there you go.
Exactly. She wouldn't be responsible for death threats.
Besides, use helicopters, not bullets. That's a joke, okay.
I don't get it.
There's a guy, socialist, who got communists and he dropped them from helicopters.
Oh.
Yeah, look, it was a joke.
Okay, so I can understand what you're saying, right? But this is difficult for me. Like, if you are trying to say a certain group are bad, evil, vile people, bad, evil, vile, again and again and again, to the point where you create a picture in the whoever you're talking to, the audience's mind, that these people are beyond redemption and they are doing vile things, like even to the point where the audience now has the impression that this group of people are attacking or killing the people that the audience are associating with, and then members of that audience go out and commit acts of violence against the people who are vilified, I think there is culpability on the person who was saying it.
Well, it depends on how well reasoned and justified it is. Because there's an objective truth there, isn't there?
What truth?
There's an objective truth in reality, what has actually happened. And as content creators, all we can do is be like, okay, here's our interpretation of that.
Okay, I see what you're saying. It's an interesting point, because guess what? In World War II, Nazis were real, and they were doing terrible things.
Yeah.
That was an objective truth, and they needed to be opposed. And so that was the truth. The problem is, in the modern day, people accuse other people of being terrible, evil people when they're not nearly that bad. Sometimes not even bad at all. They're accusing good people of these things, to the point where they are encouraging hate and acts of violence against individuals and groups as a result. Anyway, so let's begin with some of her statements on the matter and discuss. So we have our not scribe, you're there.
Alright, I'm gonna stop here and anyway, welcome. I am just sorry about that. I'm just gonna post it on Discord and be done with it. Alright, I'm opening.
Aha! Let's look at pirate swords. What swords did pirates actually use? Hi folks, Matt Easton. Here, Scholar Gladiator. So obviously I'm holding a toy pirate sword here, but there's a reason for that, and that is because I think in the public mind's eye, pirates have a form of cutlass. So the pirate cutlass is an iconic object which is featured in many movies and art and all kinds of stuff, all kinds of media. But the fact is, it is based on a real thing. But what's it actually based on? And did pirates actually have any sort of cutlass that looked anything like this at all? But the first thing to say, of course, is that pirate is a very loose term and covers a huge amount of human history and all over the world. So clearly there were Japanese pirates, Chinese pirates, there were pirates in the Caribbean, European pirates, African pirates, African pirates, Indian pirates, so on and so forth. So clearly the term pirate is very, very vague. But what I'm going to look at here is the classic idea of the pirate, as featured in with a bunch of famous pirates who we're actually going to look at some, in the period that basically covers the middle of the 17th century through to about the middle of the 18th century. And that being the case, the classical idea of a cutlass, and this is a real antique cutlass from the 19th century, doesn't really fit with that, because this is a later type of sword with this characteristic bowl guard. So we're going to be looking at earlier types of sword. But before I go on, I want to have a word about our sponsors. Thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the topic of this video, and that is pirate swords. So if they didn't use these types of 19th century cutlasses, what did they actually use? So I guess the first thing to say on this topic is that pirates were essentially like anybody else, and that they could use any type of sword. Not to say that they didn't have preferences, and we're going to look at that with some specific examples of famous pirates and how they were represented in art. But first of all, let's just have a little look at the types of swords that were available to them in this period. Now, it just so happens that luckily for you guys, I'm an antique sword dealer, so I actually have original examples of many of these types of sword available to me. Before I go into the 17th and 18th century types of swords being used, I just want to have a word about the earlier period of piracy, really the beginning of the golden age of piracy in the 16th century. So going back to Sir Francis Drake's time, for example. And in that period, it does seem that because piracy had a slightly different nature and was royally endorsed, and in many cases was just simply an extension of war, it was a form of guerrilla warfare on the seas, you could say. Many of the commanders, at least, would have been wearing exactly the same sort of swords as any other kind of military commander. So we see the typical types of mortuary-hilted sword, basket-hilted backsword, broadsword, rapiers, indeed, being widespread, and also what we'd now call side swords, which are closely related to rapiers, should we say. So we see a similar broad set of swords being carried by people like Sir Francis Drake in the 16th century. But when we get into the 17th century, we start to see piracy as perhaps a more distinct and, to some degree, less royally endorsed or less state endorsed activity, and in many cases these pirates gained such power and such large fleets that in many cases no national fleet could actually compete with them in certain areas. So they were really very powerful, and you could almost say warlords, rulers in their own right. So really what we're going to look at here is the mid 17th century, so around 1650, through to the mid 18th century, so say around 1750, which is really after the golden age of piracy. Most of the famous pirates that you will have heard of date to the late 1600s and the beginning of the 1700s. So in this period we could break swords down into essentially three main kind of types. Okay, there are types of swords carried by common people's sidearms, weapons of self-defense. Then there's upper class swords of self-defense and dueling, so we could say gentlemanly swords. And then there's also what I'd class as military swords, so swords which you wouldn't necessarily carry around on a day-to-day basis, but which were used by cavalry or infantry officers, artillery officers, people like this. So let's begin with those. So a common type of common person's weapon at this time was something that we will call a hanger. Now it did go by other names in this period, and you'll notice in terms of the blade it's quite similar to what some of you will think of as a pirate's sword, and we'll talk more about that when we look at some specific examples. But generally these are cut-centric swords with a thrusting capacity, so you can cut and thrust with them, but they are clearly, should we say, they have a preference towards the cut. They can be straight or curved, usually single-edged with a form of false edge usually at the back, and the point can take different forms. This is what's called a cat's claw or clipped back point, and that indeed is something that's featured even on the toy pirate sword I showed earlier, and we'll talk more about those as we go along. But they did have different types of points, and you could get hatchet points, spear points, different point designs on here, and they had various forms of hilt, and we'll talk more about that as well. In the hilt designs change with period. In the earlier period we have more shell hilts and basket hilts, and these weapons were sometimes known as dusak, they're sometimes known as cutto, so they go by different names in different places, different times. Dusak is a word that we find more in the sort of German and Dutch kind of areas, and then cutto is more of a word we find more in France, which becomes probably the word cutlass in England, but also in England we use the word hanger as well, probably because it hangs. You can wear it anywhere. It's a sidearm. Okay, that's what sidearm means. So that's the kind of, we could say, the civilian or kind of lower class everyday carry. Not to say that there weren't upper class versions of these as well. There were fancy versions, but so they were used by every part of society, but particularly favoured by people like sailors, it has to be said. And again, we'll come back to that. Now, the other end of the social spectrum, so in this period, the rapier had really given way to what we call the small sword. And this is a specialised thrusting sword, famously used for duelling, but in fact, it wasn't just used for duelling, it was used for everyday carrying, for self-defence, all sorts of things, and indeed, it was occasionally carried by pirates.